Okay, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. His name is Andre Clewell. He joined the Theosophical Society in 1995 and hold a lifetime membership, reside near Tallahassee, Florida, and is active in the Tallahassee Study Center. He is an Oberlin College graduate and hold a PhD from the Indiana University and is widely recognized as a leader in the field of ecological restoration. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Andre, and he can start his presentation.
Thank you. Let me get the screen share on here. And let's see, it's this one here, I guess. All right, can you see my slide here?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good. And you can hear me okay? And you can see my cursor going across the screen here okay?
Yes.
Very good. Clairvoyant investigations into the structure of matter. If you look at the Secret Doctrine title page, you will see that Blavatsky said that the Secret Doctrine was the synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy. Now, most of us in the Theosophical movement are not scientists, and we're not really that interested in science. We're more interested in religion and philosophy. But nonetheless, Blavatsky stated that the aim of this work, The Secret Doctrine, is to show that nature is not a fortuitous occurrence of atoms, and to show that the occult side of nature has never been approached by the science of modern civilization. And if you read through The Secret Doctrine, you will see that, I don't know, maybe 40% of it is on science. And this is a very important topic to Madame Blavatsky and to her teachers, the adepts, the Mahatmas. Now, in 1895, remember that date, 1895, Theosophists made clairvoyant discoveries about atoms. And these were Besant and Charles Leadbeater. And I'm sure you're all familiar with these two, but I'm going to introduce them anyhow because I think it's rather interesting, their biographical information. Charles W. Leadbeater, born in 1854, died in 1934, was the presiding bishop of the liberal Catholic Church. He authored about 40 books, lectured worldwide, was involved in the development of co-masonry, and a leader in the Theosophical Society. And he was very much a conservative upper class Tory. Annie Besant was just the absolute opposite. She was born in 1847, died in about the same year that Leadbeater did in 1933. She was radical. Today she'd be called a progressive or maybe a social democrat, I don't know. She was into the education of the poor. She wrote a pamphlet on birth control. In Victorian times, you did not write a pamphlet on birth control, particularly if you're a woman, but she did. And she'd get out on the streets of London on a soapbox and talk about this. I mean, she was radical. She was against sweatshop labor by children. She helped organize the famous Match Girl strike in 1888. And she was a friend of various socialists like George Bernard Shaw. Soon she moved to British colonial India, and she became a home rule activist. In other words, working with those Indian nationals who wanted to get rid of England and become an independent country. And she joined the India National Congress and became its president in 1917 and worked with such illuminaries as Nehru and Gandhi. Well, amongst other things, she joined the Theosophical Society in 1889, was elected as president in 1907, and she never developed her psychic abilities until she was well into middle age, about 45 years old or so. And Charles Leadbeater gave her a lot of instruction on psychic abilities, as did the Mahatma Khatumi. Now, I think you all know what clairvoyance is, the extrasensory perception of visual images. And I think you also learned about this as kids by reading Superman comic books, because everything, all this superpowers that Superman had were ordinary powers that you have on the astral plane. And I think that that's kind of prescient for the person who wrote the Superman comic books. He must have been a clairvoyant. Now, Leadbeater and Besant were taught the ability of clairvoyant magnification. And this is a very old technique. It was described 2,400 years ago or so by Patanjali. And it allows you to actually crawl into an atom and look around. And Khatumi taught clairvoyant magnification to Besant and Leadbeater. Khatumi, of course, urged the founding of the Theosophical Society in 1875 in order to introduce Eastern spirituality to the West. Okay, what did they see clairvoyantly when they looked at highly magnified objects? They saw the atoms, and here are drawings of, or diagrams of the atoms of 23 elements that they saw clairvoyantly in 1895. They had complex internal structure, as you can see. Sort of look like snowflakes. Now, in 1895, Western science accepted Isaac Newton's concept of atoms, and Newton wrote that it seems improbable to me that God in the beginning formed matter in solid, massy, hard, impenetrable, movable particles. In other words, atoms had no structure. And Besant and Khatumi and Leadbeater were saying, yes, they do have structure. In fact, Khatumi wrote in 1892 that science can know nothing of the nature of atoms. Now, Besant and Leadbeater conducted their clairvoyant investigations over a period of quite a few years, from 1895 until just about the time of their deaths in 1933. And they were completely awake during these sessions. This is nothing that you have to go into a trance for. And they had stenographers in the room, which were taking down everything that they said as they were looking at atoms clairvoyantly. They had at least one artist in there with them who would draw diagrams of what they were seeing as best as they could from their descriptions. And Jinnarajah Dasa was there as essentially their project manager. And he was the one who set everything up and made sure that all the stenographic recordings were properly filed and so on. Okay, who was Jinnarajah Dasa? He was a Sri Lankan, lived from 1875 to 1953, and a protege of Leadbeater. He got his bachelor's degree at Cambridge University in England, did graduate study at the University of Pavia in Italy in linguistics, and he was well read in science. He was a well-published educator and became the president of the Theosophical Society in 1945, I think that is. Shortly, and remained president, I think, until shortly before, right at his death. Very knowledgeable person. Now, Besant and Leadbeater looked at samples of elements, all the elements that were known to science at that time. Here's a list on the left of 36 of those elements, just to give you some orientation. There were about 85 or 90 or 95 elements known to science at the time of that they were working in 1895, and there's about 118 known now. They got their samples of minerals from various places in the world, most of them from a mineralogical museum in Dresden, Germany. And General Dasa went to Germany and picked up these samples for them. Now, a very important part of this story is that Leadbeater and Besant published their findings right away. They published an article in 1895, the first year that they were doing this work. And these articles are available today. They're online, they're in libraries. And they were published in 9 journal articles between 1895 and 1933. They published the book in 1908, which was updated shortly after their deaths by General Dasa. And that book is available today. And you can see it shown here in this slide. And you can get it from the Quest bookstore or even online from Amazon at a pretty reasonable price. And it gives a summary of all of the investigation or results of investigations throughout the years by Besant and Leadbeater.
Head west on Fagan Street toward Parker Street.
Yes. Now, the smallest object in any atom that they saw is portrayed here in the images that are on this slide of 3 atoms, boron, nitrogen, and uranium, by these little dots. You see these dots that are in here, and there's what, 5 or 6 of them inside of this structure here, and 5 or 6 here. Here they're shown a little bit larger. Here they're much smaller, you can barely see them. But these objects were always present in every element. And they could focus in further and see them in detail. And they were always the same. And they were called ultimate physical atoms, or UPAs, or sometimes Leadbeater particularly would use the Sanskrit term for atom to describe them, and that term is an anu, with an emphasis on the U. They came in 2 forms that were mirror images of each other. So they figured that one was positive and the other one negative, but structurally they were the same, just mirror images. We'll get back to looking at these structures in more detail shortly. But they noticed that in an atom, such as let me get my cursor going here. Okay, we have the aluminum atom shown over here. And these are made of these mostly triplets of these UPAs. There's one UPA, another UPA, another UPA, and they're connected by lines of force. And then these triplets combine with each other to form larger structures. And then these larger structures are combined to form the aluminum atom. And this is true for every element, that they are formed from essentially from these triplets of UPAs. And one of the first things that Besant and Leadbeater found out was that, with very few exceptions, I think 5 exceptions, all the elements had particular shapes, and there were 7 of these shapes: spikes, dumbbells, tetrahedrons, cubes, octahedrons, bars, and stars. And they also found that the shape of these elements revealed their valence. Now, as you remember from your high school science class or your college chemistry class, the valence is the number of points on an atom where it can bond with atoms, other atoms, to form molecules. And the valence then is used a lot, or very importantly, to form the periodic table of elements, which was just being formulated at the time that Leadbeater and Besant were doing their work. And it turns out that the spike and dumbbell shaped elements had one valence of 1, tetrahedrons either 2 or 6, cubes 3 or 5, octahedrons 4, bars 8, and then no ability to form molecules by stars, which were the so-called inert gases. Okay, this was pretty interesting to Leadbeater and Besant, because it showed a relationship between their clairvoyant investigations and the findings of scientists. There was a relationship between clairvoyance and Western science, and that becomes very important. And they counted the number of UPAs, or anus, in each element. They found that hydrogen typically had 18 UPAs, carbon 216, iron 1,008, and gold 3,546. And I could go ahead and list all the elements in the periodic table, but I don't think that would be too interesting. These are just good examples. Now, pardon me for having a table here of data for a theosophical lecture, but here are those same elements: hydrogen, carbon, iron, and gold. Here's the same number of UPAs in each of them, 18, 216, and so on. If you divide this number by 18, you get 1 for hydrogen, 12 for carbon, 56 for iron, and 197 for gold. And then if you compare that with what Western scientists were finding to be the atomic weights of these same elements, they corresponded very closely. 1 for hydrogen, 11.9 for carbon, 55.5 for iron, and 95.7 for gold. And this held true for every element. There was a very close relationship between the number of UPAs divided by 18 and the atomic weights found by scientists. So what does this tell us? It tells us, again, that there's a real relationship between clairvoyant investigations and Western science. However, they did discover some atoms with extra UPAs. And one of them that they discovered in 1908, they called meta-neon. It was the gas neon is used in neon lights, for instance, had some extra UPAs. Well, a few years later, a scientist by the name of Francis Aston called these, or discovered these also, and called them isotopes. So we had an isotope of neon with extra atomic weight to it. And much later, it was found out that these isotopes that have the extra weight, that weight was caused by extra neutrons, and neutrons hadn't been discovered yet, but that's what caused the extra weight. Aston, when he first made this discovery, was actually using information that he got from the first publications by Besant and Leadbeater. But later on, he published a textbook in 1922 on isotopes, and he failed to credit Leadbeater and Besant with the discovery of isotopes. And actually, those clairvoyant investigators were the ones who discovered isotopes, not Aston. However, Aston did get a Nobel Prize for it. Another relationship between clairvoyant investigations and Western science was that Leadbeater and Besant would come across impurities in the samples of elements that they were examining. And they noted that these were elements that were not known to science. And in 1909, they discovered what they called illinium. And this was then rediscovered by science in 1945 and is now called promethium. In the same way, in 1909, they found one they called mesourium. And now it's known as technetium, but it was not discovered by science until 1937, so on. So in other words, this was even more evidence that clairvoyant investigations were showing what science was going to discover later, and that there was a real relationship between Western science and clairvoyant investigations. Okay, let's get back to the UPAs now, because this is really interesting stuff. If you look at a UPA here, you see it's, well, if you count these out, it's actually 10 different whorls that make it up. And these are like hula hoops. This is not a UPA, these are hula hoops. Now, if you take a hula hoop and bend it in a little bit, it comes out to looking like one of these whorls in a UPA. And this is true of all UPAs. And here's one of Leadbeater's diagrams where he's just showing 3 of the whorls out of 10 in a UPA, so that you can easily see how they're bent a little bit to make this particular formation. But what's interesting here is that each of these whorls is not just a straight line, it's a coil, like an old-fashioned screen door spring or a spiral from a spiral notebook. And that furthermore, that virtually all of these whorls have exactly 1,680 gyres or loops to form them. So there's some real precision here on, and real detail in the formation of these UPAs. Here, this shows the coiling. On the left here, you have a spring which is coiled on itself, and then it's coiled in a second order of coiling, shown here. Well, this is exactly what happens in UPAs, except there's not 2 orders of coiling as shown here. there are 7 orders of coiling. Like this thing is coiled again on itself several times. And they use the term spirilla to designate each order of coiling. By the way, this will not be on the final exam. You don't have to memorize this, okay? There's no final exam. Okay, did other people ever see UPAs? Well, you know, Emanuel Swedenborg once described something that sounded an awful lot like a UPA, saying that matter consisted of closed vortices of energy spiraling at infinite speeds. And then there was a fellow by the name of Edwin Babbitt, who in 1878 published a book on using colors as part of the alternative healing process. And he drew what appears to be a UPA in that book, and you see it shown here on the right. And then the New Zealand Theosophist Geoffrey Hodson, who you're probably familiar with, in 1959, said that he was able to see UPAs as well. And there have been other people who have described them. So the importance of this is that UPAs were not a figment of the imagination of Leadbeater and Besant. Other people were seeing who had the ability of clairvoyant investigation. What Leadbeater and Besant said was that energy emerges from a 4th dimension and passes through each UPA and goes from one UPA to the next, and finally it returns to another 4th dimension. So it's a functional aspect to these UPAs, which involves energy. And it's pretty interesting to read the descriptions of EPAs as taken down by the stenographers. And here's a quote from Leadbeater, who got really excited when he was looking at UPAs. This is a fun quote. "The one I've got now is on its side. That's interesting. If I look at it on end, or at the end of it, yes, the enlarged end. Yes, there it is. It's coming in clearly. Gone to one anew, or UPA. It's made of spiraling. If I go to the large end and look down, I get the impression of gyration clockwise in this particular one. The spinning is immense. The shape isn't maintained all the time. It swells and goes down like a centrifugal force, makes it swell in. It's pulsing, it's lighted, very brilliantly lighted." Yeah, I bet you didn't realize that Charles Leadbeater got excited from reading his books, but here he is being very excited about looking at UPAs. In fact, this reminds me of the movie script for Indiana Jones, or some of those movies. Okay, let's get back to what Leadbeater and Besant were putting in their publications. Here is a drawing of a part of a whorl of a UPA. And this shows the smallest amount of coiling, the 7th order of coiling, and the 6th. This is the 7th order of coiling right here. You can see it here. And then it's coiling, I got ahead of myself. It's coiling again. This would be the 6th order of coiling here. And then here's the 5th order of coiling here. And this rod here just shows the axis along which that whorl is. And what's really interesting about this is if you look at, excuse me, if you look at each of these gyres, whorls here on the 7th order, it consists of bubbles in space. Nothing's connected. It's just bubbles in space. That's matter. So if you wrap your fist on a table, and it's really solid. This is what clairvoyant investigations tell you what it is. It's bubbles. And there are 1.38 million bubbles per whorl, which means nearly 14 billion bubbles per UPA. It's a lot of bubbles. So matter is made of bubbles. And Kutumi said that matter is Maya. It's an illusion. Well, this would certainly fit that very nicely. That matter consists of bubbles. Leadbeater said that the anu is formed from the flow of life force known to Theosophists as Foha, the force of which all of the physical plane forces are differentiated. When Foha digs holes into space, the anu appears. Now, about the same time or a little bit later, the scientist Max Planck proposed the quantum theory, for which he got the Nobel Prize in 1918. And he said, there is no matter as such. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force which brings the particle of an atom into vibration. That sounds a lot like Leadbeater's description of bubbles. And quantum physicists today still have this idea that matter just consists of energy, somehow contained in a way that makes matter hard rather than like a flow of energy through an electric wire. So again, there was a correspondence between clairvoyant investigations and Western science. Now, science believed that atoms lack structure until 1912, when Ernest Rutherford came up with this model of the atom that consisted of a nucleus around which electrons were orbiting. And Rutherford's atom was just about as crazy as Leadbeater and Besant's atom. If the nucleus of a hydrogen atom, for instance, was the size of a soccer ball, its electrons would orbit 4.1 miles away. That meant that Rutherford's atom consisted almost entirely of empty space. Again, you know, that's really weird. I mean, how can you think that some hard object is mostly empty space? Well, that's what physicists are saying, and it's not that far away from what Leadbeater and Besant were saying. Then a little later on, Rutherford discovered that his atomic nucleus was actually made of particles which he called protons. That was in 1920. And then in the 1930s, James Chadwick discovered that half of those neutrons or protons were really neutrons, had a slightly different electrical charge from the protons. So the structure of atoms was becoming more complex as far as Western science was concerned. And then a little bit later, Murray Gell-Mann in 1964 with colleagues found out that each proton and each neutron, here's a proton, consisted of three objects that he called quarks. And you have three quarks shown here. The letters refer to electrical charges. And notice you had lines of force in this diagram made by Western scientists uniting these three objects or these quarks together. So now we have a problem. How do we reconcile atoms that the clairvoyants were seeing with the atoms that Western scientists were seeing? Well, we got some help. Stephen Phillips, he's from England, was able to interpret these clairvoyant findings. He was a theoretical physicist and also a theosophist. And when he was doing his graduate work at the University of California, he came across the papers of Leadbeater and Besant, which were published. And he spent his entire career, I think he's in his late 60s now, if I'm not mistaken, studying the clairvoyant investigations of matter, and has come up with an awful lot of detail about the correspondence between clairvoyant investigations and Western science. And he's published 3 books on the subject that are shown here, their covers. And what he came up with was that a proton is a proton is made up of 1, 2, 3 quarks. And here are those 1, 2, 3 quarks. And each quark is made up of a UPA, 1, 2, 3 UPAs. That's your triplet that we talked about earlier. So now we have some much closer correspondence between clairvoyant investigations and Western science. And in a neutron, it's the same deal. It's just a little bit, some differences in electrical charges, that's all. So now we have the relationship between UPAs and the internal structure of atoms is determined by Western science. And Phillips showed some recently drawn models of atoms that showed quarks that were hooked together by what looked like strings. And this is now referred to as string theory. Quarks are united by these strings, whatever they happen to be. Now look at the diagrams by Besant and Leadbeater, drawn in 1895. Looks like the same darn thing, except the end objects here are not quarks, they're UPAs that are hooked together by lines of force. And so the only difference between string theory as proposed by physicists today and what clairvoyants were saying is that it's not quarks that are being hooked together like scientists say, but UPAs. That's sort of a small detail at this point. Now, I mentioned Jeffrey Hodgson, who in 1959 was observing particles. And he said that there were a lot of small particles spinning around the UPAs. And Phillips has equated these with strings that comprise so-called Higgs particles, which unite UPAs into quarks and which give mass, in other words, weight, to atomic elements. And so now we're getting into Higgs particles, which you may have heard about. Here's Peter Higgs, the physicist who theorized in 1964 the Higgs particles existed, and these were verified in 2012 at the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva. And the this made a lot of splash in the press, and the news media called these Higgs particles God particles because they seem to be the answer to what was giving weight to matter. Now, here's another thing that Leadbeater showed. This is a hydrogen atom drawn by Leadbeater, taken out of an 1895 publication. And there's something wrong with this. It shows one proton and one neutron. And if you know anything about chemistry, you know that hydrogen atoms don't have neutrons. They only have protons, and just one of them. So what goes on here? The answer to this, Phillips came up with, it's that the atoms, when they're seen clairvoyantly, collapse in pairs. And this happens in all elements. That what you see when you see clairvoyantly are pairs of atoms, not one atom at a time. Now, the physicist Werner Heisenberg in 1927 came up with his uncertainty principle when he said that observation affects the behavior of subatomic particles. This describes the effect of observation on subatomic particles very nicely. In other words, the clairvoyant investigations are showing this uncertainty principle. Okay, we talked about enough physics here, I think, to last us a week or two. Let's get on to something else. Why does science ignore clairvoyant discoveries? Why did Francis Aston, for instance, avoid talking about clairvoyant discoveries of isotopes? Stephen Phillips wrote that deep-rooted cultural attitudes towards the occult and the paranormal make most scientists reluctant to risk their careers by endorsing research that confirms the existence of extrasensory perception. Max Planck said something very interesting that is similar. He said that a new scientific truth does not triumph by converting its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. Right now, there's a group of graduate students and postdocs at Harvard and MIT who are interested in the secret doctrine and clairvoyance, whereas their professors are not. Well, after their professors die and these students take over and become professors themselves, they're much more likely to look at clairvoyant investigations as being something worthwhile studying scientifically. Well, why are clairvoyant investigations of matter important to Theosophy? Well, first of all, as I've been saying all along, it links spirituality to Western science. Secondly, it gives credence to what Kutumi and other adepts were saying back in the 1800s. It shows that they knew a lot more about science than Western scientists did, and therefore it gives us confidence that what the adepts were saying to Blavatsky and the early Theosophists were indeed valid. And that brings us to the third point. It confirms the validity of Theosophy, because virtually everything that Blavatsky was writing in the early classical theosophical authors were writing, that information was coming from Khatumi and Moria and other adepts. Now, there was a really interesting paper written by Pablo Sender in 2012 in the Theosophist, in which he showed that these adepts, these masters, anticipated Western science. And here is a list of the things that Sender mentioned in his article. The first one is the structure of matter, which is what we've been talking about today. And the second one is that atoms are in ceaseless vibration. This was not known to science when Khatumi and other adepts were saying that atoms were in ceaseless vibration. Nor did Western scientists know that space is full and not a void, which Einstein came up with in the early 1900s, but the adepts came up with in the 1800s. And that gravitation is not an inherent property of matter, also an Einstein discovery. And the cosmologists now are saying that the universe expands and contracts. That's what the adepts were saying earlier. And the sun consists of electromagnetic forces, and the planets form the accretion of plasma. In other words, the adepts were much, not better scientists, but they knew a lot of science before scientists learned about it themselves. And again, this emphasizes the point that the information that adepts were giving to Theosophists like Blavatsky was likely valid stuff. And they can do it most easily talking about science, because science can be validated, whereas if you're talking about religion or philosophy, that kind of information can't be validated like science can. So this is really important stuff. And I think that this is probably the most important paper that Pablo Sender has ever written. And unfortunately, it's buried in a couple of articles, a couple of issues of the Theosophist from a decade ago. So why were adepts interested in Western scientists? Because scientists would make these same discoveries later, and that those discoveries can be measured and compared. Phillips wrote that the wisdom from clairvoyant investigations is coded in the sacred geometry of the Kabbalah and in the mathematics of certain Hindu texts, so that this information is not just in one place. That, in other words, the occult chemistry book that Leadbeater and Besant came up with. And you can read about that on Phillips' website, which, by the way, is pretty darn detailed, and you're going to have to skip over a lot of it because you're not going to understand this detailed theoretical physics and even some of the spirituality that he talks about. But it's interesting stuff, and I urge you to take a look at it. You can just put his name into Google, Stephan M. Phillips, and access this site. You don't have to copy this down. Phillips and I published a paper in Quest in 2015, tried to get the American section of the Theosophical Society interested again in these clairvoyant investigations. And indeed, I've been able to give this talk to several different lodges and study groups around the country, and hopefully getting people more interested in science like Blavatsky was. I'd like to, for my final slide, I'd like to give you a quote from Sherlock Holmes, who said, "When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." And that's certainly true with detective work and with the detective work that Leadbeater and Besant were coming up with. But wait a minute. Sherlock Holmes was not a real person. He was a fictional character created by the author A. Conan Doyle. But of course, A. Conan Doyle was a theosophist. Okay, that's all I have for this talk, and I'd be very happy to answer questions if I can, if you have any.
Can you please put up the last slide? I would like to take down what that said. That is so profound.
Wasn't that fun?
I know. And I want to thank you for talking about the science aspect in Theosophy, because there's not very many people who come and talk about the science of it. And it's so interesting for your in-depth knowledge and sharing that with us. I truly appreciate that.
Thank you. Let me see if I can, there it is. Wait a second. There you go. I had the opportunity to talk with Pablo Sender a couple of months ago, and we were bemoaning the fact that a few scientists who are in the American section of the Theosophical Society, and we're both trying to get Theosophists to be more interested in science.
I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, it's kind of a comment with a question on top of it. And I know that I brought home a book once. I was very fascinated to learn the history of India and some of the things that they had invented. And things like in the 17th century, they were doing cosmetic surgery where, I read about this ear replaced on somebody, and or somebody's nose was replaced. And then you read about batteries and airplanes, and they invented the 10, 1 to 10, the numerical system that we are based on. And these things go back hundreds of years. And also many of the Indian people have meditated, and they have received information on I think I remember atoms as well as Native Americans. And I just wondered if you might, and I think it's interesting that, let's see, Leadbeater, he lived in Australia though, didn't he? And
part of his life, yeah, he spent some time in Australia.
Yeah, and but a lot of this stuff that you're talking about, really, they had discovered previous to this in the Indian culture. And so I'm just wondering about, they went into this collective consciousness aspect of all of this scientific discovery. I'm just wondering if you might comment on that, because it does seem like, they are one of many clairvoyantly that got this information. Yeah, like I'm saying, the early Native Americans, the early Indians, and we're talking about thousands of years ago. And of course, like you say, it was not, people didn't take it very seriously. I mean, the Native Indian culture was just totally thought to be ignorant and so forth. And of course, they were brilliant. And so just thought maybe you could comment on some of all of that, kind of the nature, the culture, the collective consciousness with all of this.
There's not a body of information out there on this. You know, most of this is oral history, and oral history has just not been recorded. And I can't really give you much insight to this. Now, in Blavatsky's collective,
Let me tell you, you're a lot more muddled. It's harder to hear you. I don't know if you changed your voice from when you were giving your presentation.
oh, I'm trying. Okay, I'll try. I said that oral history. Most of this that you're talking about is oral history, and it's not been recorded, and so we don't have that information available to us. And I really can't give you much information, but I do know that in Blavatsky's collected writings, I came across a statement that she wrote that the Advaitis, in other words, the Advaita Vedanta, that there's not one iota of difference. That was her wording between that Vedanta and Theosophy. And so evidently Blavatsky was of the opinion that, yeah, the early science of India was indeed valid. That's as close as I can get to answering your question.
You said the earliest science of
The science that you were talking about
was what?
Was valid.
Valid, okay.
Yeah. I'm trying to get out of share here so that you can hear me better.
Yeah,
See me better.
if you scroll down your cursor to the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, I'm trying to. Oh, here. Let's try that. There we go. Finally. Okay. Now I'm back with you. Can you hear me better now?
I can, but I do want to say this was very amazing information. Totally amazing.
That's what I think. I'm every time I talk about this, I'm amazed.
For example, they proved Heisenberg's effect before Heisenberg even noticed it was there.
Yes.
Hi, Andre, I have a question. So in terms of science, most of the investigation were done using what sort of instrument? Because
None.
my understanding is science try to use external instrument to try to do these observation and investigation. But from a occult perspective, most of that is a subjective, right? Using our personal self as the instrument itself to do the observation. So is that the barrier between science versus the occult? Because the occult you have to use is a subjective manner where the subject is the instrument doing the observation versus science is always externalized, or it had to be objective in the
That's
sense
right.
that the instrument itself had to be something external to yourself. You know, you can only use the electron microscope to go down to a certain level, but beyond that, it's not capable of using it for observation, especially at this level of, you know, beyond the atom itself.
Yes. Well, this is strictly a meditative technique. There was no instrumentation involved at all. And like you say, it is definitely subjective. The correspondence comes from coming up with the same conclusions as Western science has come up with. And so you have to assume that the subjective technique is just as valid as the objective technique.
So most of the discovery that are in the later year for science right now, are they still in the theoretical phase right now, or have they been proven?
Well, like Pablo Sender said in his essay in the Theosophist, they've been proven from the standpoint of Western science. Each of those, on that slide that I showed of Pablo Sender's results, each of those discoveries has garnered a Nobel Prize for the discoverers. And so they're considered valid by science. And it's just amazing that they were discovered by clairvoyantly before the scientist was able to make the discovery.
I want to ask you, you know, I guess it's well known that Einstein had a copy of The Secret Doctrine. And I wonder, I've just heard that statement, but I don't know any more about it. Do you know any more about that?
Well, let's see, Cranston's biography of Blavatsky, she goes into this a bit. And I've heard that, I've seen it published in other sources as well. Evidently, it's pretty well documented that Einstein did indeed have a copy. I don't know anything more about it than that. I don't think Einstein went around talking about it. But it's really interesting that he had that copy. Of course, Einstein had some statements about religion too that were not scientific.
Yeah.
Hello, Mr. Clewell. My name's Jesse
Hi.
Herrera. I have a question for you, and I'm a little confused. In the diagram that you showed of the hydrogen atom,
Yeah,
and how Leadbeater said that they collapsed on each other,
yeah,
and then you said that, well, everybody knows that hydrogen atom has one electron and one proton.
yeah.
Aren't there
One
some?
neutron. One neutron and one proton.
Oh, okay, one neutron. But isn't there some forms of hydrogen? I think it's called deuterium.
Yeah, deuterium.
That's what
that is the isotope of hydrogen. But this is not the. He was not looking at the isotope in this investigation. At least that's
Okay.
what Phillips says.
Well, that's
Supposedly, when you do clairvoyant investigations, you have to slow down the spin of the atomic particles. And this is what causes the collapse. You slow down the spin using your mind.
okay. Because I was just, what is heavy water? Isn't that because of the heavier?
Yeah, the deuterium. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I was just, I just had to clarify. I'm not a scientist or anything, but I do love to read the
Yeah. I'm a
scientific.
biologist, not a physicist, so I'm sort of on the edge of my knowledge too.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Anything more? Well, I thank you for asking me questions that I'm able to give some answers to. I always appreciate that.
Thank you, Andre. Truly enjoy your talk and learned a lot. There's lots of stuff in terms of his history of the TS that I didn't know, and especially our founder as well. So
Yes,
thank you for sharing that with us.
I'm very happy to have been able to do so. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording.